Working with square roots, we already know that, so far we already know that we can't write negative numbers under square root. Okay, so typically, whenever we have a positive number in square root, we say, okay, so for instance, the square root of 9 is equal to 3. We know how to find that. Or square root of 16 is equal to 4. But whenever we have square root of, for instance, of a negative 9 or negative 16, typically, if we don't know anything else, then we say that this not a real number, or it's an imaginary number, or something like that. So the question is, how can we deal with the square root of negative 9 or square root of negative 16? And it turns out that there is a handy way of dealing with that. If somehow we introduce an imaginary unit, and somehow we say that the square root of negative 1 is equal to some kind of variable, but it's so important that we use a specific variable I to mark that. So introducing this type of notation, making the square root of negative 1 being some sort of I, turns to be very helpful in the mathematics, and not just in the mathematics, but in the other areas of science. And it actually has a real applications. But we're not going to go too deep into that. My goal is trying to explain how this type of thing, how this type of notation help us to deal with the roots or square roots of negative numbers. Okay, this kind of notation, or marked as I, is called an imaginary unit. And it has a very important property that indicates that if I is equal to the square root of negative 1, then I squared, so if you square this number, the I squared, okay, turns to be the square root of negative 1 squared, which is the negative 1. So if you have I being the square root of negative 1, then I squared is negative 1. So square of this imaginary unit turns to be a negative number. Okay, so think about that. Typically, the square of any number is positive, but in this case, because I is the square root of negative 1, its square is, um, because I is the square root of negative 1, the square of I is negative 1. All right, so we have this notation, and now let's see how this can be used to simplify the expressions like square root of negative 9, square root of negative 16. So our next problem is simplify the square root of negative 4. What do we do with it? So in order to simplify this type of problem, this type of expression, we rewrite the square root as the following. So we are rewriting it as the square root of negative 1 times 4. Then, using properties of square roots, we separate the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 4. Okay? So we write it as a product of square roots, as a multiplication of square roots. Now, we know that the square root of negative 1 is I. And so we can write that the square root of negative 1 turns to be I, and the square root of 4, which is positive number, turns to be 2. Okay, so taking this into consideration, our answer turns to be 2I. So it's not a real number, it's an imaginary number, or we also call it a complex number. Okay, so the square root of negative 4 turns to be 2I, turns to be a complex number. What if you have something like this? So it's a square root of negative 2 times square root of negative 8. Most people say, hey, let's just put them together as a square root, as one square root and solve it. But in reality, we are not allowed to do that. What do? We simplify each of these roots separately and then multiply. So the square root of -2, square root of -2, turns to be the square root of -1 times 2, which is the square root of -1 times the square root of 2. Okay, and that turns to be the I times the square root of 2. Okay, so we have the first one. Now let's focus on the second one. The square root of -8 is equal to, again, the square root of -1 times 8, which is the square root of -1 times the square root of 8. And this turns to be I times the square root of 8. Okay? Now, when we have each of these roots simplified, we can get back and simplify our original expression. So we have the square root of -2 times the square root of -8 being equals to I times the square root of 2 times I times the square root of 8. Now, multiplying I with I, we get I squared, okay? And then writing the square root of 2 times the square root of 8 under the one root, so we get square root of 2 times 8. This turns to be, so let's see, we already know that I squared is going to be -1. So it turns to be -1. Remember that? So so I is the square root of -1, but the I squared is -1. And the root turns to be the square root of 16. We already know that square root of 16 is 4. So we get -1 times 4. And that turns to be -4. So the simplified answer to our question is -4. Okay, so I hope it helps to deal with square roots of negative numbers. And you can look at, or you can review these examples and see how these type of problems are simplified. It works not just for multiplication of square roots, but also for division. So you can also try to simplify the square roots of negatives and then divide and see what you get. Okay, so again, I hope this helps, and I hope it's useful and it doesn't make or doesn't create a lot of confusions.